Do you want to become a CFO and take control of your career? Our podcast series From Go to CFO will give you a unique insight into what it takes to become a successful CFO. Hosted by the three amigos at AXR Recruitment and Search, myself, Greg O'Shea, and my colleagues Kunal Gupta and Nick Constein, we speak to inspiring and successful CFOs from our network as they share their career journeys with us. It's the closest thing you're going to get to delving into the mind of a CFO. We hope you enjoy it.
Welcome to today's episode of Go to CFO. My name is Nick Constein, Associate Director here at AXR Recruitment and Search. Today, we're joined by Byron Bassett. Prior to his role as CFO at Unilever, Byron has held a variety of leadership roles across impressive blue-chip businesses, including GlaxoSmithKline, Woolworths, Dyon, Johnson & Johnson, and most recently, Key Pharma. In this episode, we'll talk about leadership lessons, how to build trust and accountability inside a team, why the CFO role is shifting toward Chief Value Officer, and how to stay relevant in an environment being reshaped by AI and automation. Thanks for joining, Byron. How are you doing today?
Very well, thanks, Nick. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us. To kick things off, can you just give us a little bit about your background? Where'd you grow up? Tell us a little bit about your life before your career.
Yeah, so I grew up in country New South Wales in a town called Inverell, so a town of about 10,000 people up in New England, about an hour and a half north of Armidale. And I grew up on a farm there, so mixed-use farm, so wool initially, and then wheat and cattle. So 3 siblings, brother and 2 younger sisters, and always farming. So family had always been farmers. That's kind of the lifeblood of what we've done as a family for a long time. So I grew up there in a country town. Our farm was about 40 kilometres north of town. So pretty isolated, but what a childhood. Could not have wished for a better way to kick things off. And so I went to school up there and then was fortunate enough to get a scholarship to come to Sydney to study at UNSW here, and then have been in Sydney ever since and have gone from there.
Yeah. What was that like moving from a small town like that and then landing in Sydney? I guess that would have been a bit of a culture shock, I guess.
Yeah, the bright city lights were a bit distracting to begin with, shall we say, for the beginning of my university career. But what an experience. I mean, I left when I was 17. So to come to Sydney, of all places, and to have been in a very non-culturally diverse part of the world, to then I remember my first day on campus at UNSW and just the multiculturalism, the diversity of people, it was absolutely mind-blowing, but fantastic in all the best possible ways.
Yeah, fantastic. And so after finishing university, you started off at BAT. What was that like? What led you to that decision? Kind of what was the thought behind joining BAT?
So it was a bit of an unusual time, actually. So this is 2008-9, so peak of the global financial crisis. And grad jobs were actually pretty thin on the ground. So certainly there was a period where for finance and accounting grads, a lot of the grad programs actually got pulled. So people that had offers were sort of being pulled and saying, actually, we have no certainty on what this looks like. And we don't actually know when we will have a grad program ever again. And I had done an internship at BAT the summer before for year end because they were a university sponsor for the scholarship program. And I actually had a wonderful time there over that summer, working with some really great leaders. And so when the offer came and sitting there and weighing it all up to go, wow, I'm going to get this amazing development experience, absolute class A investment in people and learn kind of the best of the best from a systems perspective. I said, let's dive in and let's go and make the best of it that we can and learn as much as I could on the way.
Yeah. And I think every person I've ever spoken to about BAT grad program has just raving reviews. And I think it's the variety of exposure that you get. I think that's something that's pretty impressive. What did your rotations look like? Did you have a mix of different opportunities or?
Yeah, so I did everything. So management accounting, financial accounting, supply chain finance, marketing finance, treasury, taxation, the whole box and dice. And I got to spend 3 months living in South Korea as well, in Seoul, which was a real cultural awakening as well for me. And again, the kinds of skills that those experiences develop in terms of that rapid acquisition of skills, that part of, well, I'm having to learn and deliver simultaneously in a foreign environment are nice skills, which I think you can take forward after.
Yeah. Korea is electric. Seoul is an amazing city. It'd be fascinating to work there. Was there noticeable cultural differences, like from a working perspective?
I mean, massively. I mean, so this is 2009. So you've got all kinds, I mean, people could smoke in the office still. So that was quite different here in Australia.
Yeah.
And we would sit in meetings where everyone would speak Korean and then one person would turn and translate the rest to me. So it was a bit lonely, if I'm honest. I think there's a part of that which is feeling like an outsider. And at that time, I mean, Korea's changed a lot.
Mm-hmm.
The K-pop phenomenon was just sort of kicking off at this time, and Korea's become a lot more open. But at the time, it felt pretty closed. And I'd been told going there that actually it could be quite a lonely setup. And so I actually spent a lot of time on my own, which in a way is helpful as well from sort of a reflection and keeping yourself occupied and busy perspective in a foreign place where you don't speak the language. But again, a wonderful cultural experience to sort of, to go into a completely foreign environment and almost have the chance to reinvent yourself, but also go, this is my first work placement. It's not a holiday. It's actually, I have to work and deliver. And I've got people back in Australia wondering what I'm up to and how I'm going. So it was great.
So you moved on to GSK, obviously two different products with two very different kind of organizational missions. What was that like for you moving from there, from BAT?
So I think ultimately I got to the point at BAT where morally I just felt like I couldn't see myself in that organization for the long term. I had incredible relationships, mentors, friends. The culture was amazing. But as I started to think about what being a father might look like and the kinds of things I would say to my children around what I did for a living, morally, I got to a point where I just felt like that wasn't going to work for me anymore. So when I was approached by GSK, you're right, hard pivot from an industry perspective into healthcare, but working in an organization for the first time that had this really clear science-based mission effectively as part of the guiding light of the organization. And I mean, it's, health is a pretty robust industry to be in. It's been on a pretty good growth trajectory for a while. But I think the other part that really appealed to me about GSK, so this is the consumer arm of GSK, which is now Haleon, but before it had been split off. And it was effectively the hobby division on the side of this global pharma conglomerate. So actually the systems, the processes, the ways of working were pretty underdeveloped. So I got to go in and set up commercial finance in that business. And that was a great experience to walk into a very sales dominated culture that we're not used to being told no, that we're not used to focusing on profitability as opposed to growing top line turnover or even just moving boxes, and to set up that environment and to really lean into some of those constructive differences between functions and holding the organization to account was a really foundational experience for me.
Yeah. And so how do you go about that process? Because I think that sounds on the surface level pretty daunting for someone coming out, relatively young in their career. How did you go about the change management component?
So I think a healthy dose of self-confidence probably doesn't hurt. In the beginning, I think I was 26. So I think the first thing is to really take the time to understand. And that applies to all roles, all spaces, is that really intentional listening or sponging phase in the beginning, which is that I'm here and I want to understand. And to be honest, at that time, I came in probably a little bit too hot. I was very clear on, guys, it's very clear to me where we need to go. Let's just move here as fast as we can. The profitability wasn't where it needed to be. Business performance wasn't great. So I effectively missed a trick by trying to move the business too fast and not being focused enough on the change journey, not being focused enough on, while it might have been as clear as day to me, it wasn't that way to everyone. And understanding that actually everyone had a very different set of stakeholders to manage, of KPIs. And that was really the first time I guess I had seen, the first attempt to move the business from a change perspective didn't work because we tried to do too much too fast, and actually got a few people offside because of the fact that I didn't take that time. So it was a good example of what not to do in the beginning. So when we get around for the second go, for the second budget cycle, things were much better. But I think to look at it and say and understand actually that an organization is an ecosystem of diverse characters who have all got different agendas, who are all trying to do different things. And so how you work within that and how you kind of think about what I describe now as being a hobby psychologist around how do you understand people's implicit or explicit drivers and how that dictates the outcomes they're looking for is a super important foundational skill, particularly for finance business partnering.
Yeah. And so when you, as you acknowledge that that's an important skill, did someone tap you on the shoulder and go, hey, you need to learn this skill set? Or was it more just trial and error and then realizing, hey, this is actually something that I really need to develop to get to what I want?
So I was fortunate enough to have some really great leaders at BAT who I stayed in really close contact with. And I had seen the way that they had influenced, shall we say, that group of senior leaders in those other functions to sort of get the outcomes they were after. So it was actually helpful to go back to the beginning. And because I had those relationships still and was still close with that group of people to get that advice, to get that mentorship, which is, look, I'm really struggling here and help me understand how I'm kind of getting this wrong. And that approach to slow down a little bit, to take your time and actually learn a bit of patience, which was not my great skill, certainly in my 20s, was a really helpful piece to go back to.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Really interesting. And so having worked mostly in commercial and business partnering roles, you took a financial controller role at Activation Blizzard. What was that like? Was that a conscious thought? Were you trying to round out a skill set to make it to CFO? What were you thinking?
Very much so. So I think because I didn't have an audit background, so because I hadn't come out of the Big Four, and financial accounting or control was not my specialism, and to be honest, not my passion either, but I was very clear that I would never get a CFO role if I didn't have that. And it's always this interesting discussion and debate that people have is, well, if you're going to do it, when are you going to do it and how? And so I was really fortunate actually that the planets aligned for me, that a role came up as financial controller in one of the world's largest video game companies, of which that was a large passion of mine throughout my entire life. It sort of felt like the planets aligned and that was the right thing for me to do. So I went into that knowing that it was going to be difficult. And I was very explicit with the team that I was going into that it was not my skill set and there was going to have to be some rapid learning on my part to get up to speed on that. But it was this purposeful piece around how do I go about acquiring the skills that I don't have to set me up in that piece moving forward. And so, I went into that organization and it was a rapid learning curve. It was full end-to-end P&L accountability on the control side and in a complicated business. It was the first time I'd worked with digital revenue as well. So this is when, the beginning of kind of the esports boom, but certainly in terms of the world of microtransactions coming into Call of Duty was the first year that happened when I was there, and how we were working with that trade-off between physical and digital product and working with vendors around that. And it was also when there was a concerted effort at the time to focus on multinational organizations, the amount of tax that they were paying in Australia. So it was the year that the multinational anti-avoidance legislation was introduced. So I spent a lot of time with some Big Four partners going through what that looks like. But again, from a foundational learning perspective, and to really have to jump in and effectively put yourself in a sink or swim situation, I got a lot out of that. And I was fortunate to have a team under me who were really supportive, who knew that that was not my skill set. And the first time I probably really lent into understanding that actually a team needs to have this synergistic element, which is that actually together you can become something that is greater than the sum of the parts. So whilst I had great financial accountants under me who could help me on all of those pieces, I could help them on some of the other pieces, influencing the business, career development, how we get to working with some of the stakeholders. So it was great.
Yeah. And I think when you get in that sink and swim type scenario, you have to have this accelerated learning and this adaptation that gets you up to speed quite quickly. What do you do then, or what did you do then, and what would you do in future roles to help you accelerate the learning process?
So I think the curiosity piece is really important. And I think the other piece, which has been this real interesting shift, I would say, in corporate psychology, is the concept of vulnerability in terms of being very explicit about what you don't know. So that outdated sort of thinking of going, well, I'm coming into a leadership role in a business and I'm expected to have all the answers. But actually how powerful it is to come in and say, I actually don't understand this. Sorry, guys, this might be a stupid question. Maybe I'm the only person in the room that doesn't understand this, but I'm stuck on this or this or this. And actually, the way that there's a fear element of that, which is I'm admitting that I don't know what I'm doing in this room of people. But actually, because you approach it in such an open and authentic way, it's pretty hard for people to look at that and say, this guy, they're saying, well, actually, you're game enough to say you don't get it. So being really clear on understanding what you don't know and being not afraid to ask for help, I think is important. I think there's an element of resourcefulness, which is really interesting about how do you go about finding out what you need to find out. And I think university, for all its pieces, I think that understanding of how do you go about the acquisition of knowledge and how do you find it. And you think today in a world where AI has come into everything, I mean, certainly we didn't have any of the AI tools back then, but that piece around how do you use those tools to your advantage to rapidly upskill in a way that gets you the answers that you need, I think is pretty helpful in no matter what you're looking to do.
Yeah. And so After your time at Activision Blizzard, you left to Dyson. And obviously that's very well known now. But as you joined, it was probably in its infancy in Australia or very recently part of Australian businesses. So what was it coming like from these large, well-established brands to basically a startup within Australia?
It was very different, but in the best possible way. So Dyson had been growing pretty aggressively, but really only in vacuums at that point in time, or floor care. And the year that I joined is the year that the business launched the supersonic hairdryer, so exploded into beauty for the first time. The first set of connected products came out that you control with smart devices, the beginning of smart home. And it was a big multinational organization, but effectively run as a set of autonomous countries. So the level of autonomy that we had locally was huge. Effectively, as long as you delivered the P&L, you could kind of do whatever you wanted. And so it was so entrepreneurial. It was so invigorating to walk into an environment where the level of possibility that we had was just so refreshing. That piece of when you've been in really big corporates that have very strict processes, to walk into an environment where we say, well, we know what we need to do, but how you get there is up to you, was really exciting. And I think, again, really kind of nascent processes in terms of how it was set up from a planning, forecasting, core finance perspective as well. So the ability to build that and really rapidly take what good looks like from other organizations into that business was great. It allows you to build credibility really fast. But that real spirit of this is and I mean, it's still a private company, we're a private company that can move fast and effectively was still run at that point in time by James Dyson himself. So that ability to make a snap decision in the UK, which was then expected to be replicated overnight around the world, that can create some growing pains in terms of how it worked. But that ability to sit there and just really get specific on different bits and pieces to say, I mean, we here in Sydney and King Street is just down there. I mean, we had a request to open a retail store in Sydney and we had to figure it out in 3 months' time. Now, for a business in Australia that's never run retail and anyone that's worked in retail, that's not exactly a simple thing. So to find the space, fit it out, figure out how you're going to manage the stock flow, how you're going to get the point of sale working, are you going to have cash or no cash, but to say, well, we're very clear on where we need to get to, but have that freedom and flexibility to make it happen was so exciting. It was one giant adrenaline rush.
Yeah, that's unbelievable. 3 months is not a long time when you're talking retail. And so how do you even manage like the stock, because obviously it's not manufactured in Australia. So how do you manage establishing a brand new supply chain and a whole new process in that amount of time? I mean, it must have been chaotic.
Well, I think we had our own warehouse. We had a fair bit of control over the process, but it really taught me, above all else, the importance of having the right people in the right roles. So at that point in time, I was finance and operations director. So I had finance, supply chain, IT, property, all sitting in my remit. So actually most of the backbone of that sat with me. And I had an incredible group of people in that team who were all actually more experienced than I was. But the ability to unleash them all to say, hey, you're the subject matter expert in this, and I don't know what you know, but I need, help me find a way to do this. And that freedom in a framework to give people to say, there's a very clear link between responsibility and accountability, which people need to understand. But to say, I need you to figure this out. And here's a bunch of money and here's whatever, and let's go and prototype and let's rapidly figure it out. That's so exciting for people. I mean, to go anyone in their role to say, I've really got the ability to personally shape how this is going to go without multiple levels of approval above country or whatever is really exciting.
And so do you think because of the uniqueness of your role where you had oversight of multiple functions, it gave you better flexibility or operational advantage to be able to deliver something like that, as opposed to then coordinating, say, if you had a technology person and then an operations director? Like, do you think you're in an advantageous position?
At that time, yeah, definitely, because I think there's a shorter decision-making chain. And I think that's something when you work in organizations of different sizes or maturity levels, is understanding that the length of that decision-making chain has a direct correlation on outcomes sometimes. So I think that ability to sort of see the end-to-end outcome, but also to be able to pull that group of people together who needed to work really powerfully as a group and know that we were all part of one team. It's not finance versus ops versus whatever. It is actually, we are FinOps as a team, And actually, we need to do this together. So actually having that respect and understanding on camaraderie between that group was so powerful to know we were all invested in each other's success and we all wanted the same things. So when things get difficult or where you get those tension points that come up, is having everyone understand actually that we all want the same thing was great.
Yeah, fantastic. And so you moved to J&J, back to a big business, obviously very well established, global brand. What was that like going back to that type of organization? And it was also a really interesting time. It was around COVID, I think you started, if I'm not mistaken. So what was your first impression and kind of what did it feel like being back in that bigger business?
So again, really, really different. Johnson & Johnson at that time as one giant entity, 150,000 people globally, enormous revenue and profitability, big presence here in Australia, 3 completely separate divisions existing in that space. So incredibly successful, well-run processes. So there's a bit of a whiplash effect you can feel when you've gone from having a lot of autonomy in that space to having less. But again, a really clear mission, a really clear directive to walk into, but really challenging from a understanding and scale up perspective because of COVID. So I joined 4 weeks before we went into lockdown and I had a 6-week-old daughter. So our second daughter was born just before that. So I think for everyone, that was a really challenging time. And personally, I remember sitting in my lounge room on my laptop thinking, how is this going to work? I don't know the business. I don't know my team. I know I'm meant to be doing something, but I don't really know what that is. I've got a newborn who's not sleeping. I've got, we're all then, the 4 of us all trapped in the house trying to figure that out. It was a lot, but I guess it was a lot for everybody, right? Everyone has these really powerful personal stories and reflections from that time. So I guess the whole world was sort of in it together. And I think those times of sitting around and these kind of bootstrapped amateur type town halls, which, we all take working digitally pretty natively now, but back then huddled around a laptop, people trying to get their backgrounds right, people trying to figure out how that's going to work. You're on mute, share your screen, all that stuff we joke about. That actually brought us together as a leadership team pretty quickly as well. And I think that piece of having team members as well, going through some challenging personal circumstances at the time, is that need to really get to know people and connect with them, but virtually. How do you build trust? How do you build that cohesion in a team, which had also gone through a lot of change when I came in? When you're trying to figure out what's going on, you've got things shut down. Being in healthcare, we had products going out of stock the second they hit the shelves. I mean, cold and flu medication, you couldn't make it fast enough. And then trying as a leadership team to think about what does that response look like? How do you think about going back to work and the risk factors, and then having these briefing calls as a company director of the organization in terms of what the risk factors are, what are you potentially personally liable for? It was a lot. But again, that ability to go, okay, we are here together and focusing on controlling the controllables. I mean, I think a lot about growing up in that farm environment in the country is, there's a wonderful piece of stoicism which exists in that community, which, stoicism sort of come to everyone maybe a little bit more recently now, but, farmers are pretty tough people. And that focus on, well, you can only control what you can control. And you might have busted yourself to get your summer crop ready to go. And then a hailstorm comes in and the whole thing gets knocked down and you've got zero income for the year. And that's devastating financially, but it's also completely outside of your control. So having watched my parents really kind of lead the family through that and say, focus on the controllables, sphere of control, sphere of influence, etc. How do you focus on what matters? And if you can't change something, then don't bother worrying about it. Just get on with what you can control.
That's great advice. And it's so true. Talking to someone who runs an agriculture business and, when you have these things that happen, like a drought or a fire, it's nothing you can do. Fix what you can and do what you can and then crack on and just keep on. It's great advice. Interesting. And so that role, what was your exact role? You were in a divisional CFO role at that role?
Yeah,
what was
for the
that
consumer
like?
business.
So why did you take that role?
So my time at Dyson, Dyson was rapidly corporatizing, I guess is probably the best way to put it. So a lot of the processes were coming in, roles were changing. So my role went from being this kind of broad CFOO role back into a very narrow sort of finance scope at the time. And when J&J came knocking, that's one of the biggest companies in the world. It was a team rebuild. It was a new local CEO who had a wonderful vision that I believed in and wanted to go for. And really for Dyson, the only path for me was abroad at that point in time. which had been put on the table. But we had, my wife was pregnant with our second child at that point in time. And actually we wanted to stay in Australia. So the ability to go into a really big business again, into a space that I knew well from that, very, very similar business to GSK Haleon, and the ability to do a team rebuild with a new leader, it kind of ticked all the boxes for me, which was great.
So you were in this interesting role because I guess that then became Kenvue. So can you just give us a bit of context of what that looked like what did you go through with that?
Yeah, so similar to how Haleon was split out of GSK. So Johnson & Johnson decided that it was going to basically break off its consumer arm. And a lot of conglomerates are going through this setup in terms of saying, okay, we're going to streamline and simplify and really give shareholders focus, I guess, as opposed to saying, well, we either want an FMCG business or we want a pharmaceutical business. And a lot of those synergies maybe that you once upon a time you had in a really big conglomerate probably aren't as relevant anymore. So the business decided, okay, it was going to split out. And so that was an unusual experience to say, okay, we're part of this enormous big beast and now we're going to be standalone. And we had the other two divisions here in Australia, the medical devices and pharmaceutical divisions as well, where we said, okay, we're going to be separate and standalone. So that process of understanding the unplugging the plumbing to say, okay, we've got deeply intertwined legacy businesses and actually J&J started as a consumer healthcare business back with Band-Aid way back when. So actually that was the home of everything, the home of all the employee contracts, the workers' compensation, the long service leave liabilities, all of the legal entities. So that very methodical process of pulling that apart was an interesting experience to live. But I think what that created for me really purposefully was when Kenvue split out of J&J, the business was restructured into 3 business divisions effectively. And I was given the opportunity to step into one of those roles as general manager for one of those divisions. And that was something I'd always wanted to try. I think I'd always thought I'd like to see what a potential path into general management could look like. So that ability to move completely out of my comfort zone into a role like that with P&L accountability for that part of the business and have marketing and category and working with sales in a totally different pivot was something that came out of that for me. And that's one of the most wonderful experiences I've ever had.
Yeah. What surprised you about that, moving from finance to general manager? What are some of the things that took you by surprise?
I think there's this really interesting piece of, you can look at something logically and say, well, it's very clear to me how that should work. Back to the GSK days, trying to think about that. But actually understanding that people come from really different backgrounds. So as finance people, you take things just as a given, right? You understand margin and profitability and accruals and provisions and all those pieces. So those things just roll off your tongue and you just say, well, that's just how we work. But then to work with a group of people that don't have that, but they have a different language and way of thinking around segmentation, targeting, positioning, differentiation, distinctiveness. How do you execute a campaign? How do you launch a product? So working with a really different group of people who are reporting to you, looking for you to have the answers of which you don't have because you don't have that background. So I think that was a really great learning experience for me. But I think the other really interesting thing is that as the CFO, you're kind of in this co-pilot seat a lot of the time, which is great. But ultimately, the call quite often is not yours. You'll provide advice. You will say, my recommendation is, but you'll align behind the GM's lead in terms of what you want to do. But to have people looking to you and it to be your call, and also to have the CFO looking at you and saying, you're behind on the numbers, you need to find something, you need to find a way, and actually be sitting there and going, that's actually hard.
Yeah.
There's a part of that where I had the benefit early in my career for working for some, let's call them ivory tower CFOs, who would say, the business is in trouble. It's very clear to me what needs to happen. Sales, you need to sell more. Marketing, you need to spend less. I'm cutting travel entertainment. Walk back to the corner office and say, job done. And that's not how you build credibility in a business. But to sit on the other side of that and have someone say that to you, right? And to sit and go, well, I can't will the market to grow. I'm in this absolute knife fight in FMCG, particularly in grocery in Australia. And if you don't have innovation or you've had your spend cut, like how do you work within constraints? How do you be really creative around how you play with the portfolio you've got, the levers you've got to pull, the relationships that you have to deliver an outcome? And that's a bit daunting and a bit scary. But I think having some experience at that, working with that group of people, again, approaching it in a way where you take it as a learning opportunity and have absolute humility in terms of, hey guys, like I do not understand. I need a rapid knowledge in how do I get across what marketing looks like in those spaces. I think all those things ultimately make you a much better CFO as well. Because again, back to the example of saying, well, guys, just figure it out. Well, now I know what that feels like. So now back in a CFO role, I look at that and say, I know how hard that is. I know to sit there and say, well, guys, like, yeah, of course we would like to sell more, but that's not just to send an email with a table and say, guys, just do this and this and this. So understanding what you're asking people to do, and that actually there's got to be a level of rationality or some sort of logic that's gone into how you've got to that position, and understanding what you're asking people to do, I think ultimately helps with how you land that credibility.
Yeah. Very good. Very good. And so you then transitioned to a CFO of a privately owned, obviously very successful business, Key Pharma. It's a very different dynamic to large multinationals. Again, you're probably going back to the more entrepreneurial style or, that legacy of ownership. What surprised you about the transition, or what were your first 6 months like, adjustment in that role?
There was definitely a lot of similarities to the Dyson experience in the sense that real entrepreneurial ability, but the fact that it's not a multinational either. So literally, I describe it as the business is quite tangible. You could have everyone in the one space. You could kind of see the business with your eyes, and it was sort of just small enough you could kind of get your hands around it. But I think the thing that surprised me about that is, again, back to the piece of saying, you walk into an organization and you can almost say, okay, I've seen this movie before. It's clear to me what we need to do from a re-engineering the portfolio, the commercial strategy, how we want to go to market. But I guess what's different in a business like that surprised me is that for a privately owned, founder-led business is it's not actually all about the commercials. That emotional investment that founders have in an organization, that it's not just about the P&L anymore. I mean, that's obviously very important. But if this is, this is an intergenerational family business where actually that's the family legacy, right? It's been bootstrapped and built from nothing. And so, I think back to growing up on a farm, like that's the family business, and have, people come in outside and say, hey, this is how you run your business. That's a difficult thing. So to say, okay, that kind of understanding that actually there is a high level of emotional and emotive engagement with that group of stakeholders on the board, in the leadership group, which is really important to understand. And so having that taking the time to understand the context is really important. Decisions are not made in a vacuum. So you can say, well, I don't really understand how we've got to this point. But say, okay, well, help me understand. What am I missing? How do I do that? It's really important. Yeah,
the complexity is completely different when there's an emotional attachment to decision making. Yeah, understood. You've worked with both founders and professional CEOs. What are the key leadership traits you've seen that drive that success?
Oh, I mean, I guess there's more than one way to cut that, right? I think what I've seen is that actually different styles can be effective in different organizations and at different points in their life cycles. You need a certain leader at some point, and maybe you need a different one in another point. And we see that through some of the big startup and scale up journeys which go on, is what is that decision that's made to bring a professional CEO or CFO in, and what does that kind of growth trajectory look like? So there's that. But I think the commonality around understanding that, that piece around a leader can't do it all themselves. And what is that pivot point people make on their career journey where they understand, actually, I can't brute force something through my work ethic, my intellect, my et cetera, is I need to actually get the right people in the right roles. And having seen a lot of different leadership styles, is the thing that keeps coming up is successful businesses have the right people in the right jobs, and they're clear about what they expect for them, but then they let them get on with it. And I think that's a really powerful piece, being purposeful around the skill sets that you need in the business and going and being intentional about getting them and then letting them get on with it.
And so how do you go about that process? So how do you build, how do you set the tone of expectations for their performance? And then also on the flip side of that is, how do you build or establish credibility with them?
So I think what I've seen work pretty well is to actually start with really clear expectations, right? And not so much even on the line by line deliverables, but on the big rock outcomes. So my approach that I like to think about now is to say, you start with 100% trust. I trust you. I've hired you, or you're here and I trust you, right? 100%. So trust is given and then taken away as opposed to needing to be earned. And then I'm very clear, which is this is what the expectation looks like. These are kind of the non-negotiables on the things like deadlines, on risk, etc. But be really clear on kind of that, the big rocks, freedom within a framework. And then say, I'm going to give you, Nick, all the tools you need to be successful in the job within reason, and be very clear on what that looks like. And I'm going to give you that level of responsibility and autonomy, but that's very clearly linked to accountability. But then I'm going to get out of your way. And we're not going to get into, okay, we're going to have a weekly whip, and in that whip, you're going to show me a to-do list of what you've done. It is Nick, my job here from a servant leadership perspective is to help you. What are the things that only I can do? Is it something needs to be unlocked? Is it a resourcing piece? Is it something political we need to lean into? Is it a conflict that I can help you with? But actually to let you run your space as autonomously as you can. And again, I was really fortunate earlier in my career to have leaders that gave me that space. And even in the beginning, right, as a management accountant, what your freedom or your, leadership of self looks like, how you design reports, how you might engineer some formulas. But that ability to give people a level of creative expression in how they're going about getting to an outcome, I think is actually a really powerful way for people to build engagement. It's always worked for me. Individually, that's how I like to be managed and operate. But I think when you do that for people, when you say, hey, I respect you and your background and your skill set, and you've come here and actually we're going to do this thing together, and I'm not going to micromanage you. I'm going to give you this kind of framework or guideline, but then I'm getting out of your way and you just get on with it and you come to me. My experience is that people tend to like that. They don't like to be micromanaged. They don't like to be, and again, if things go wrong, if there's a piece where you need to dive in and things happen, then that's a different scenario. But that ability to give people the space to find their own solution to it in that kind of entrepreneurial way, whatever that may look like, I think is really helpful.
Yeah. And so I guess the other side of that would be building the credibility among a board, or, you're newly established, if you're the newest member of the leadership team. So how would you go about, or what would be your suggestion for someone who's starting off and they've never interacted with the board or have never been in a, C-suite type role?
So I think understanding your stakeholders individually is really, really important, particularly on a board environment, because a board is made up of individuals, right? And particularly when you've got non-execs who don't work day to day in the company. So that ability to kind of build that relationship with those people is super important. But I think people can sometimes overlook kind of the basic strategic framework, right? Which is step one is diagnosis. Like, what is actually going on? How do I spend that first 6 to 12 weeks being really clear on what is actually going on? And by that, I mean, not necessarily that, okay, these KPIs are here and here and here. Like, what are the root cause challenges that the business has? Are we treating symptoms or are we treating the disease? How far up the pipe do we need to go? So to have that really clear diagnosis and actually bring people into that diagnosis phase, which is, hey, Nick, I'm curious about this. This is what I'm thinking. What do you think? So you're kind of building it together. So then when you come and you bring your diagnosis to the situation, is people feel invested in that, but there's a really powerful intentionality there, which is I've taken the time to go deep, to understand the history, understand the context, which is respectful as well. Because again, going back to, we've all seen people that turn up in an organization and just go, this doesn't work, we're doing it this way. But to go, well, how did we get to this point? What are the push and pulls? And as part of your diagnosis, you're building a mental map of the stakeholders, who has influence, who's making what decisions, how does that work? So you come with this very clear diagnosis and say, are we as a group aligned on the problem? That Einstein quote about 99% of the time on the problem and versus on the solution. Are we clear on the problem? And get everyone bought into what is the job to be done? Because people get that wrong all the time. And there's this, this desire to jump straight into tactics. And particularly as a new leader, is you want to build credibility, right? You want to show I'm justifying my hire. I'm going to come in and I'm going to make moves. But actually to say, I've taken the time, I've been respectful, I've done my listening tour, I've gone deep in the organization, I've gone cross-functional, and I've said, okay, are we as a group aligned on the problem? And if everyone's aligned on the problem, that is at least 50% of the problem, right? What is our job to be done? We have a profitability issue, we have an efficiency issue, we have a branding issue, positioning, whatever it might be. So everyone's clear on the problem. The next phase is strategy, not tactics. People always want to get into tactics because as human beings, and particularly when you're in fast-moving industries, there's this desire to be action-oriented, but to say, okay, what is our strategy? And the strategy is in response to the diagnosis. It is not we want to grow. Well, everybody wants to grow. So The strategy is a response to the diagnosis. We are all aligned. We have a profitability problem. Therefore, our strategy is to grow operating margin, gross margin, whatever it might look like over this time frame for these reasons in response to this diagnosis. And everyone's bought into that. That needs to not be your strategy, mine. It needs to be ours. There needs to be buy-in on that strategy from the board, from the rest of the leadership team. So then you get everyone in. We're clear on the problem. We as a group own the strategy, which is important if things don't work later to say, okay, we're all in on it. And then the tactics follow that. So it's this very clear and it's documented and everyone's clear on it and feels invested in it, in the outcome. So then you jump into the tactics, and those tactics are thoughtful, they are considered, they are in response to a very clear strategic framework. Because when things get messy, you can always come back and say, we said a year ago our strategy was to do this and this and this. Are we on strategy or not? Does this feel right? And then when you're talking to the entire team is to say, guys, this is the strategy. So whenever you're being asked to do something, if it doesn't fit in with this strategy, why are we doing it? So I see, that piece to kind of align, and it can be frustrating for people like, I'm very action oriented as well. So I want to get things done, but to have that whole ownership group aligned just creates it's an investment, which creates this efficiency of outcome after the fact, because then you're not arguing about, well, are we on the right strategy or not? It's no, guys, we've already agreed that. We can choose the tactics. We can say, well, we think there's a different tactical way to get that outcome, but you're all aligned. And that ability to align the senior stakeholders around that is time well spent.
Yeah, that looks like a worthwhile investment, because I guess a lot of companies, we see it from a recruitment standpoint where we have this great strategy, and then you actually send individuals to go for the interview and they go, well, the CEO and the board aren't aligned. The board said this, the CEO said this, what am I actually going to be doing? And then mostly the CFOs are going, I'm not that interested. I can't get alignment, or a view a view of alignment between the board and the CEO. So we see it from a recruitment standpoint. So it's interesting getting it from the organizational perspective. And
having gone through it, it helps you in those interview pieces to ask those kind of questions, because you're looking for that. You're looking for, well, are they aligned? Because if not, that's going to be a problem. It might not be today or tomorrow, but at some point there's going to be a problem if there's not alignment.
Absolutely.
So having seen leaders really effectively manage that relationship has been really great.
Yeah. And just to kind of shift the topic a bit, you touched on previously working with AI, and it's obviously becoming a bigger part of our world. How do you see AI moving forward? Is it a way of replacing things or enhancing, or what are your thoughts on that?
That's kind of the topic of the day. So I feel like I'm a little bit behind actually in this piece on a work front. I would say personally, I'm all in. I'm having lots of fun using different models to solve different problems in creative and fun ways. So from a work perspective, it's really interesting to see some organizations have really pushed the boat out. They're really all in, and others have been a bit more slow to move. Now, part of that is risk appetite as well. I think having seen the way that a few different organizations approach intellectual property, the way they approach, how controlled, or do you let everyone run wild? There's some great examples in the press of where that's happened and gone very badly, where things have leaked into the public domain. So I'm still learning. So I'm doing some online courses and pieces now to sort of get myself up to speed in terms of how I can apply it in a work sense, really purposefully. On the future of work, I feel this is a really controversial topic. I feel like people can't talk about it in an unemotive way. I guess if I think, and this is my opinion, right? My opinion is that I think absolutely technology and AI will replace some roles. I think even in the course of my career, we've seen massive shifts in, I've been in onshore Australian finance teams of 100 people, full stack, accounts payable, receivable, all the way through. And those things just don't exist anymore. Now, some of that has been replaced by systems, and some has become labor arbitrage, where you've said, okay, well, you've got hubs, which now might exist in Manila or Bangalore or in Poland somewhere, where you've got these kind of hubs. And that's a very P&L driven decision, which is, okay, the cost of a head here versus the cost of a head here, let's do that. But actually, I think you'll probably see that slow down, because people go, well, actually, you're not talking about the marginal cost of labor anymore from an individual head perspective. So I think we're in this really interesting space. But I think if you think about fundamentally, particularly in finance and accounting, how many people's role is preparing information to present to somebody else? And to have that ability to really rapidly turn that on in a zero cost environment, I think, there will absolutely be impacts on people. And I think where it gets sticky is that for people that are already in senior roles, I think it's easy to forget or maybe be willfully ignorant of the plight of people at the beginning of their career. Because when you're already above a certain level, it's the lower level roles that are being replaced. You will look at that and say, okay, it's clear I still have accountability for X, Y, Z. I have this career tenure and experience, and I need to be here to make strategic judgment calls moving forward. But if you're 22 and you're coming straight out of university and you need to find a grad role, you need to get those foundational experiences that come up, I think it's really hard. There are not these kind of entry-level roles that exist. We've got big companies, and I think, the two functions I think are being really impacted at the moment are finance and legal, right? Law in particular. There are entire firms that have no grad programs anymore. They're saying actually that can all be done by AI. So you have this kind of senior leader environment where you've got work being generated by a few people, but getting this multiplier impact out. But actually the challenge is when you get to that watermark, you probably feel you've got a little bit of certainty, but getting to that point and navigating it now, it's really hard. I don't have an answer, but I think it's something to be really, really cognizant of. And I think as a senior leader, you have to be, have your finger on the pulse in terms of what is possible and how it works. But I think, we need to spare a thought for the next generation coming through. How do we give them that? Because I have the conversations all the time where people say, AI, it can't do these things, or it gives me this rubbish output or whatever. But the reason you know what good looks like is because you've had that foundational experience. So how do we give people that, and how do you build that pipeline of talent is going to be a really important consideration for us to have as we go forward.
I agree wholeheartedly, completely. All right. So in the last section, this is where I think most of the listeners really like this piece. It's about your experience and kind of some of the lessons learned. And I'd be keen to ask you, what is the best piece of career advice you've received from a mentor?
So the best advice I've ever got is effectively your outcomes in your career are driven by sort of three factors. Those factors are that you need to have some modicum of skill. You need to have an idea of what you're doing. You need to be capable enough. The second is that you need to work hard enough, not necessarily saying you kill yourself, but you also can't be taking for a ride. You have to work hard enough. And the last piece is you need an element of luck. But the way that the luck was explained to me, and this is by someone who's a mad keen golfer, here's the analogy, and I've never forgotten this. US Masters 2005, the 16th hole. Tiger Woods is one stroke off the lead. It's the 16th hole. He's got an impossible shot, 30-foot putt, long way out on the side of an aggressive slope. It's a sand bunker on one side. There's the water on the other. Tiger sits there and he sizes it up. He shoots, 25 feet to the left, all the way up the hill. The ball rolls all the way up, comes back down, and it's an iconic shot. It's on YouTube. The ball sits on the rim of the hole and it wobbles. And then it falls in, right? The crowd erupts, everyone goes wild. Now, some people looked at that and said, that's a 50-50 shot. That's luck that fell in the hole. But the reality is because of everything that's happened in the past, that's a shot for the win, right? It's not a shot for 7th or 8th. So all the preparation has happened, all the hard work has happened so that when luck comes along, you can capitalize on it. So, the saying that luck is preparation meets opportunity is, I think that's great advice. So I think that piece of going, absolutely. There's an element of luck, particularly. I think if you asked a lot of senior leaders, if not all, they would say some point along the way, they were fortunate to get a start or a role or something. But again, you've got to be you have to have done all the prep such that when luck comes your way, you can jump on it.
Yeah, I remember that. I actually remember watching that as a kid. Yeah, that's interesting. Okay. And I guess the last kind of thing, we've talked about when we caught up previously was, life comes at you fast. There's other components outside of just being a martyr and working a million hours a day. So how do you go about balancing the big picture, family, health, work, all the above?
Well, I guess I'm still figuring it out. I certainly don't have all the answers. And, I'm in a proud dual career household. My wife's got a fantastic executive career as well. And that's a lot. that's a lot for us as a group to navigate and manage. And we often joke that, with 2 little girls, that we're running a full-blown logistics operation between travel and all those bits and pieces. And we don't have family support around us in Sydney either. But I think it's being really clear on what are the big rocks in the jar. That piece around, well, my family is the most important thing in my life. So that will always come first. And so if I get a call at 11 o'clock on a Wednesday that one of my girls is sick or needs to be picked up, then I will proudly and loudly get up and go and get them. And I'll work from home or I'll do whatever I need to do in the afternoon. But I think that's the stuff that's important. And I have seen firsthand friends, mentors of mine who will openly say they haven't got that right, who will say things like, I wasn't there for the moments that mattered. And therefore, I'm estranged from my kids, my marriage broke down. And so, that wonderful piece around, the richest man in the cemetery, like that doesn't work for anybody. So being really clear on what are the big rocks in the jar. So family, absolutely. I think from a health and fitness perspective is, again, having seen good friends who are moving on a little bit in places is actually when things start to slow down a bit, you can get away with a lot when you're in your 20s and 30s. That real intentional investment in your health, which actually makes you a more effective leader. It makes you, the corporate athlete, pick whichever piece you want. Those pieces make you more effective in your role. And the difference between lifespan and health span, in terms of which, the narrative is moving now, super powerful in terms of, okay, you need to be really focused on that. But I think all those pieces of, having things outside of work, which are yours, which are important to you, and having things that are purely selfishly yours, which you do just for joy. You do it because you love it, not because, you feel you need to. Or whenever I interview people, one of my favorite questions is, what do you do for fun? And I'm shocked at how many people say, well, I used to play golf, play the guitar, run marathons, etc. And now I don't do that. So that piece of going, you are a full-sum human being. So what do you have in your life that's just for you? And as an adult, it's really easy to forget that piece of what joy looks like. And I think if nothing else, having children has really shown me that kind of unadulterated, unfiltered joy of just being happy and just not having any expectations. And so doing something that is just for you and only for you, that you just do it for fun. I feel that helps me stay fresh. It keeps me sharp. And that's why you're doing it, right? You work to live, not the other way around.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's a fantastic way to end today's episode. Thank you so much for your time. It's been great. And obviously the insights, I think, are going to be really well received. Really great episode. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Nick. Really enjoyed it.
Thanks for tuning in, and we hope you enjoy the insights from our network of inspiring finance leaders as they share their journey from Go to CFO. If you're looking to make the next move in your finance career or build your team, get in contact with the team at AXR Recruitment and Search today. We're passionate about building careers, not jobs, teams, not just hires. If you enjoyed the episode, hit the like button and subscribe today. See you next time.